Okay, so we're back working on the Acura CL. In our last video, we worked on getting everything off the transmission, getting all the wires, the cables, everything, and propping it up and supporting it so that we can get in and loosen up the bell housing bolts and eventually drop down the transmission. So just kind of thinking about this, I have a bunch of wood. I think I'm going to stack it up underneath that, and I'm going to see if I can remove this by perhaps not using a transmission jack, and let's see how it goes. Uh, my understanding is that this specific transmission, as well as a lot of the Honda transmissions, may not be that heavy. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a shot. We also have a jack under there that'll act as our support aid. And then the wood will just stack up around it just so that it doesn't come crashing down when we do remove the bolts. So that's where we're at right now. Hopefully this content is going to serve everybody. We also went ahead and tried to order some replacement brackets here just so that these things aren't rusted out. We will work on rust prevention as well and getting everything coated so that it presents well, and that's where we're at right now. Can go in real quick and just show you how we remove that transmission. So you can see here I have a jack underneath and some wood just as a safety measure so that if it did come crashing down and slipped off the jack, it wasn't going to hit concrete floor. It was going to hit some wood, and then hopefully that would take up most of the blow from that drop. Luckily that didn't happen, so it was kind of just an extra precaution, like I said. As you can see here, now we've got the clutch exposed, or at least we've got the pressure plate and the flywheel there. Here's our transmission on the ground. So here's your fork that will push out on your pilot bearing, or I'm sorry, your throwout bearing. And how it goes in is just like this. Oh, go like that. And then you've got your bearing that goes in here, and then it sits in there like that, just kind of crudely. When I look at the bearing, there is definitely some wear on here. It's still pretty smooth, which is good. I mean, for 105,000 miles, which is what's on this car, it seems to have held up really well. Thankfully, you can see kind of where that pushes up against right there. So luckily this is in good shape, although we are going to replace it. We're also going to replace the spring on the back side of this, or at least I hope. I've got it on order. This needs to be all cleaned up. You can see here we've got a combination of kind of clutch debris and what I would assume is probably some oil from rear main seal maybe leaking a little bit. Either way, we'll get this all cleaned up. We'll go through the process of what you need to do to replace all the seals on this and all the sensors, so no worries there, we'll get into that. There are a couple hidden fasteners on the bell housing, so let me go over that real quick with you. Let's get in there. Okay, so here's our clutch right here. You can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bolts right there. And then just remember that there's dowels that go in here. So there's one there, and there's one right over there. So you want to make sure that all that's good and in place. Make sure you've got some nice sealing surfaces here. We'll clean up all of this before we do anything else, and then we'll take a look at this clutch here in a moment, and we'll see what kind of condition it's in. Odds are it was due for replacement at 105,000 miles. But that's kind of the gist of it. So not all that bad. I would say this probably took me about 3 hours to get to this point. Mostly just getting everything out of the way, being super cautionary about not breaking anything on the way out with the transmission. That's probably the most important thing, I would say. So it doesn't really serve you to just rush this and break things on the way out. Just take your time, be very careful, know that things are heavy, know that things are likely gonna break if you try to force it. I just put a little bit of pressure on here. You may have not seen it in the video, but I took a small pry bar, and there's certain points along the way that you can just kind of gently nudge the transmission back out before you slide it down and out of the way. So that's just my word of caution for you guys. Just be careful. Okay, and here's the manual. So if you want to reference the manual real quick, you take out the transmission support structure right there, that beam, and then this is how you do it with a factory jack. But more importantly, here's 4 bolts on the engine side that you should remove, 2 at the bottom there, and then 2 higher up. What I ended up doing was using a extension and a deep socket to get to these 2 at the top, and kind of weaving my way up through the J pipe. That seemed to be the easiest way to get that down. And then the rest of this is installation. So if you've gotten this far, you're pretty much halfway done with the removal and clutch replacement. This is just how you go about reinstalling it. So I'll just take a quick picture and sweep over for you guys, and you can pause wherever you want along this way. But it's pretty straightforward so far. This is probably one of the easiest transmission removals and clutch jobs I've ever done. Usually Hondas are pretty easy, but this one is going pretty well so far. All right, so part of our journey here is going to be restoring everything and cleaning everything up, obviously. Our focal point is obviously changing the transmission, clutch, and flywheel assembly and doing a general maintenance on all the corresponding items while we're in there. But we're taking the opportunity to clean everything up. There's nothing better than having a nice, fresh transmission, clean appearance, getting everything refreshed like it was new out of the factory. So you can see here, I've kind of done a 50-50 split. Here's what it looked like when I initially took it out, and here's where our efforts are so far. I'm basically just taking a wire wheel and cleaning everything up, because that's the most effective and easiest way to remove all this buildup and get that nice aluminum polish back. But I'm not going to overdo it. I'm going to try to keep it so that it doesn't look like it was over restored or kind of ridiculously restored. So we'll get to a point where everything's cleaned up, and then the parts that are visual, I'll try to get those brush marks out from the wire brush that I'm using on a drill. But for right now, this is probably the easiest way to go about it. All right, so let's talk about the clutch itself. The clutch itself is probably the most important component of your drive line when it comes to putting down the power, besides your tires, obviously. But this is the mechanical aspect of that. So let's talk about the clutch for a second. You can tell that the clutch is starting to wear on this. This is likely the OEM clutch at about 105,000 miles. And we can see that it's pretty worn. just by looking at these rivets right here and seeing how much material is left extended beyond the rivets. Once you get to the rivets, that's when your clutch starts to slip, starts to make a little bit of chattering noise because it's actually grabbing metal to metal. And so that's a strong indicator that this clutch would need to be replaced. Ours had a little bit of life left on it. You can see here, when we look at the profile side of it, this right here still has a little bit of a lip left there. So we probably could have gotten maybe another 25, maybe if we drove conservatively, 50,000 miles out of it. But that's not the reason why I'm replacing it anyways. It wasn't because I was slipping, it was because I was having some weird clutch engagement issues, and we fixed some of that with the slave cylinder there that we did an earlier video on. But I think what was happening here was that the moisture was getting into the clutch assembly and it was giving me a weird engagement feeling. But also you can see here we've got some definite discoloration going on, which means that there's probably a little bit of heat that was crossed over. So these probably got a little hot, and that probably may have contributed to some warpage. I don't know. That's speculation. But let's look at the surface. So this is our surface of our pressure plate. And besides a little bit of dirtiness right here from removing it, you can see that there's no significant hot spots here. But what you can see is a little bit of glazing going on in certain areas and a little bit of rust formation on the outer edges. And I think that might have been what I was noticing. This little bit of rusting on the edge here was probably moisture that got in and slightly contaminated our pressure plate and clutch, because as I drove this, it got better and better. So the more you drive it, the better the feeling was. This is a self-adjusting clutch system. So you have a dual mass flywheel. That's why you don't see any springs here. This is a fixed unit. The um, the flywheel down here is dual mass. So when you go to move this, it will engage and slip a little bit. It'll twist, and that'll be what compensates or what changes for the lack of springs on your disc plate. Over here, our pressure plate is self-adjusting so that you always have that same engagement point regardless of the life of this. And we can see that here's your marking so that we are using OEM Luke. And there's also a marking on the flywheel down there that's a Luke as well. So we know that we're using the right parts when we buy a Luke replacement. And also, just so you know, if you buy an Exidy clutch pack that's also manufactured by Luke, they have like some sort of patent on the clutch system here. So either just buy whatever is the least expensive when it comes to Exidy or Luke. They're all the same. But these little springs right here are your self-adjusting points. So you can put pressure on this. So this one's already obviously used, but you could put pressure on this with a shop press and you can reset the self-adjustment here so that you could reuse this. We're not going to do that, but you could just so you know, that's how you would relock that. You would press down and then you could use like a screwdriver to push the spring back over to the point where it engages. So that's how that functions, but we're obviously going to go all new. This clutch is not going to go back in. It's basically just for reference at this point. And we'll install a new pilot bearing, the Nashi pilot bearing. I got everything in a box there set up and ready to go. And we'll get the car pieced back together. All right, after you get the transmission removed, you're going to want to start looking at the engine side of your work, which is the rear main seal. And I point this out because there's a gasket that's behind this plate that accompanies the rear main seal, which is right here, that you're going to want to replace while you're in here with the transmission out. These bolts that I'm showing you all around this flange plate, or this plate, seal to the oil pan. You can see there's some bolts and how they go and protrude through. This is where you use your Honda bond. These bolts right here are 10mm bolts. They go all the way around the plate. They're torqued to 8.7 foot-pounds. And then these bolts right here are the bottom of the oil pan. They need to be removed so that you can get this plate out. This is actually the main reason why I'm replacing or why I've got the transmission out. It's not because of the clutch issue, it's actually because the rear main seal was leaking. This happens as the age of cars just gets up there, so it's kind of more of a maintenance item for me. But here's your part numbers. Here's that little O-ring that's behind that plate and the part number. And then here's the rear main seal and that part number for you. So we'll go ahead and get this plate off, and then we'll show you what it looks like behind here. Okay, so we've got the plate off, and we can see our crank here. We can also see that passage with that where the oil ring and O-ring go right here. And then there's this little bead of Honda Bond that they've used. My car is original, so there hasn't been any tampering from anybody else. This is how they sealed it from the factory. You can see here's some oil that's coming in. Likely we've got a little bit of drainage that goes down into the oil pan. And here is our plate. There's that oil ring. Here's your rear main seal. So this is what this looks like. Pretty simple. So we'll go ahead and get this cleaned up. We'll also replace that O-ring at the top and our rear main seal. Get that seated in, and we'll look to get it reinstalled. Scrape off this Honda Bond that's here. Reapply some nice new Honda Bond, and then we'll get this back up and going. Okay, so we've got the plate all set up. We went ahead and took all the old gasket material off the side of it, and we have our new rear main seal installed. Now, the great part about the rear main seal is that it's very easy to install and take off. I just use a rubber mallet and a piece of wood just to tap it in and then just hammer it all the way home. I did want to show you the difference between the O-rings because it is a quite starkly difference between the new one on the right and the old one. Look at how flat that gasket is. I don't really mention the flatness of it, but it is so hard that it's almost like a piece of plastic as opposed to this gasket right here. And that goes right there. So we're going to get that all set up, and then we'll go ahead and reinstall it after we put some nice Honda Bond all the way across the edges of it. So we're almost getting this wrapped up. And here we are with everything back installed. You can see there's this thin line of Honda Bond that squeezed out. That's ideal. Got enough around there so that we have a good seal. The O-ring at the top here that I showed you is a little bit delicate. It wants to fall out, so just make sure that you put like a little dab of Honda Bond on there to hold it while you reinstall everything. And then this is 8.7, like I said, foot-pounds all the way around, and you'll be good to go. Okay, and now we have the transmission out. We're going to go ahead and do an inspection on it. We cleaned it up already. I want to just point out a couple areas that you're going to want to focus on. So make sure you get all the grease and debris that's inside of this bell housing. You're going to get a ton of caked on stuff, regardless of how old or new your clutch is. Even just now, there's still some in there, but we want to get most of the grease out of this, and the reason being is that it could fling and contaminate the clutch. So we also want to take a look at our shaft here, make sure that there's no significant play here. Ours is good. We also want to take note of this right here, this little ball joint, because this is where your release fork is going to go on and your bearing is going to go here. We want to make sure all of this is nice and clean. We'll clean that up, get all of this little caked on stuff right here off. That way we have a nice smooth surface that we can grease up. Also, you're going to want to have some spline grease that usually comes with your clutch available so that you can coat this right here. This will allow it to slip on a little bit easier and ride a little bit tighter. Here's our first seal. There's another seal on the back side of this that we're going to pop out. It's really easy. You can just take a long flathead screwdriver and just pry on this until it pops out. You sometimes can even get them out with your hand if they're a little bit loose from removing. Ours isn't, so we'll have to pry that out, but no big deal. Then we did a general cleaning of the whole transmission here. We even did a little touch-up paint. This is where your shift fork or your shift cable is attached to. So you want to make sure that this is clean right here. When you do reassembly, you're gonna grease this up anyways. We do a special coating that creates a low friction surface on top of the grease there so that there's not any premature wearing and marring of this. So you have a nice smooth shifting. And just you want to make note of all the other subsequent areas, like wire connections aren't broken. Let's see, we've got a couple on this side. So you just want to take note of that. Make sure that you have a good transmission in nice, clean working order before we do reassembly. Okay, we've got our release bearing or throwout bearing installed. You can see here we're just testing it. So what you want to do is install the bearing to the fork and then install the fork by inserting it here through the hole and then gently gliding this over. And this should move without resistance. It then clips in because you have your clip that goes around here. That's, remember, packed full of grease. So we pack that full of grease and then it clips right in. And then you can go like this, and this should be pretty much like this. It'll slide, have a little bit of play, which will get tightened up when the transmission's on, but it'll go like that, and that's how that operates. And now we're all ready to put the boot back on and then get the transmission ready for reinstallation. Hey everyone, we got the transmission back, made it together with the engine. So it was a little bit tricky. I started filming it and then it just didn't go well for me because the output or the input shaft for the transmission ended up getting caught as it was trying to go together. And what I found is that the engine had tilted down. So if you look at your engine, right now it looks pretty flat, right? Because I have it supported, but it dipped down, and that dip made it almost impossible for me to get the transmission cleared on this rail right here. And then it started getting caught on the rear support beam, or the rear beam to the cradle. So that was a bit of a struggle. Finally got it together. And the key, I think, is make sure that your engine is level. So you can see here we got the engine pretty level. Then use a supportive jack underneath to make sure that it doesn't dip down. And then you can use your engine support beam right here to attach to your anchors on your transmission here. And then there's one back there that I don't think you can see, but trust me, there's one back there. And that'll allow you to basically suspend the transmission and give you a little bit easier time getting that mated together. It'll just slide right in when you've got it right. So once you get it mated together, you want to put in your top bell housing bolts. There's one here and then right there on the left, and then there's one just a little bit further back on the back side of the transmission. That'll allow it to get the top in, and then I went to the bottom. So there's two that are directly on the bottom here, so opposite of the two in the top, there's two on the bottom. And that will allow you to close the gap, because there'll be a little bit of a gap there that you'll need to close. Then you go around and just do all your bell housing bolts that remain, and that's how you put it back together. Now we've got to reassemble, your shifter cables. We got to reassemble the wiring harnesses and all the sensors. We're going to have to do a little bit of touch-up paint. So this got scratched right here, but otherwise we're on our way putting everything back together. Looks pretty good and clean. I'm excited to see if it works. Hopefully we don't have to take it back out, but I think everything will be fine. Okay, so I thought I would give you guys a couple tips in the ending part of the video here. So when you're jacking up the transmission, it's best to make sure that you have the jack and the transmission in the right orientation. What that means is that it's very easy for the transmission to cant this way or cant that way, more likely to cant that way. And there's a pretty significant flat spot on the transmission here. So let's go ahead and take a look at that real quick. So you see this part right here? This is all flat. If you can get your jack positioned so that this flat part is being supported with your jack, that makes it relatively easy to jack up the transmission and put it into place. The other tip I'll give you is, you see this beam right here? This is supportive for the transmission. If you can get your mounts attached to this beam prior to putting your subframe up, this makes it a lot easier to actually get these two bolts in. And the reason why I say that, these are very tight tolerances. So if you try to put your subframe in and then try to do these bolts, you're going to have to take this beam off, bolt it together, and then bolt it to the transmission, which is a little bit more difficult than you would imagine. So ask me how I know is how I would phrase that. But otherwise, it's fairly simple. So let's go to the top and I'll show you where you put your transmission fluid in. But this is where you put your transmission fluid in, 3/8 end, so you can use an extension. And it's usually fairly tight on there, so you're gonna have to use a lot of torque. So whatever you use, make sure you use like a breaker bar or something like that. You're gonna have to use likely more force than what you're expecting. Once you do that, then you can just use a funnel, put in your 2.5 quarts approximately into the transmission, and then you're good to go. A little bit too much, not a big deal. A little bit too little, maybe a larger deal, but it's about 2.5 quarts that you want to put into that. Then you just button everything back up very slowly, methodically, make sure that you have everything that you need. So you can see like our shift cables right there. You can see our bolts. You can see our flex hose for our clutch coming off the damper. And then our clutch line goes all the way over to our slave cylinder, which is not in place yet, but it will be shortly. Then you put your engine damper right here, tighten up your engine support and your subframe bolts, and it's pretty easy from there. It's actually not that complicated. So don't overthink it. Just do everything by piecing it together. Make sure that you're thinking about things before you put it back together. Does this make sense to go into this location? Then you'll be good to go. So exercise in patience and just make sure that you think about where things are going before you actually go and do it, and you should be fine. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this two-part series on replacing your clutch and how to remove the transmission, reinstall everything, and we'll catch you on the next one. But here is one critical step. You want to make sure that you torque down your sub-bolt or subframe bolts appropriately. And so the two in the front are 76 foot-pounds and the ones in the back are 83. And basically you want to just incrementally get that subframe back up. Don't try to like do one side and then do the other. It'll just make it cattywampus. So that's just one tip there. And then you're basically putting all the components back together in a series. It's really not super critical about how, the part that you do it in. It's all about what you want to do, how you want to order operations. But needless to say, if you took apart your slave clutch and your hydraulic line for that, you're going to need to rebleed that. It's also safe to assume that if you did anything with the brakes, which you shouldn't have, but any hydraulic component, you'd want to make sure that you bleed those. So that's super critical for the functionality, specifically in our case here, the clutch. So if you disconnected your slave for any reason, you'll want to go ahead and reattach that and bleed it. Also, take note of you want to grease the end ball here, which we went over earlier, but that's your throw-out bearing fork. That's where you apply the grease, and you also want to lubricate your shift cable attachment points. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward, just going back and reattaching everything. But I'll go ahead and give you the torque specs for everything here, in case that's of interest to you. And then you're all set.